welcome back and welcome everyone to Humanist Canada's monthly webinar series. I'm Anna Popovich, Program Director at Humanist Canada, and I'm pleased to welcome today our guest, Chris Fairweather, for a conversation about unions and Canadian politics. Just a reminder that this webinar will be 60 minutes in length. We will have a Q&A period at the end of the presentation. If you have a question and would like to ask it directly, please raise your hand at the bottom of the screen. You can also submit your question or comment with the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen as well. And just a heads up that this webinar will be recorded. Chris Fairweather is a PhD candidate in the School of Labor Studies at McMaster University. His research examines the politics of work, labor movements, and nationalism and internationalism in the Canadian labor movement. Chris is also a longtime labor activist and the leader and past president of the Canadian Union of Public Employees. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. And over to you.
Sure, yeah, thanks. Maybe I'll start by just rolling up the presentation. And then, yeah, I just wanted to say, to start by saying thank you to Anna and Humanist Canada for putting this together and extending the invitation to me to come and chat about some of this stuff. As Anna was saying, my name is Chris, and I'm a student at McMaster University in the School of Labor Studies, and I've been a very active union member for, the last 10 years or so. And I've experienced union life in both the private and public sectors. And as a student, my research looks at unions and global politics, obviously from a fairly Canadian perspective. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and Haudenosaunee people. I acknowledge this as a way to remind us of our shared history, how that history connects to the ongoing mistreatment of Indigenous people, and the collective responsibility that we share to try to right those injustices. This is an organization dedicated to, achieving progress through reason and critical thinking. And the webinar that I've put together today is all about how regular working people really can change not only our workplaces, but society for the better. And in that context, and in the context of a settler society like ours, I think it pretty obviously means that securing justice for Indigenous people goes hand in hand with trying to secure justice for working people more generally. A better society for workers obviously can't come at the further expense of Indigenous people. And when we have discussions like the one I hope we have today, we obviously have to keep that front of mind. So today I want to talk about why I think unions need to be political and what that means practically speaking. I want to talk about a few of the many problems that workers and their organizations are facing today. And I want to unpack some of the complicated and delicate contradictions the labor movement has to confront in forging a path forward. I'm hoping that my remarks won't take much longer than half an hour, 35 minutes or so, and that we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end. I think the answer to the question posed in the title is yes. And for me, I think after a long time studying these things and participating in these things, I think the answer is a very obvious yes. But I think it's a yes with an asterisk, and I think the asterisk is important. So but I want to start today by making the case for unions. Unions are an important part of Canadian society, and I do think there are lots and lots of reasons to believe that, yes, unions are a significant force for progress in Canada and around the world, even with all the challenges that they're facing. Unions make work better. They make it less exploitative, less dangerous. They make it more rewarding and secure. And in turn, they also make society better by making it less unjust and less unequal. The graph on this slide is from the United States, and it's become familiar, I think, in recent years. It goes around on social media every once in a while whenever someone wants to remind folks of, one of the important things that unions do. It shows the relationship in a general sense between income inequality and union membership. There's obviously a lot going on in that middle section of the graph between the 40s and the 80s. It's not just the high degree of union membership that lowered inequality. During that time, there were higher taxes on corporate profits and ultra-rich individuals. There were more redistributive social programs and so on in the United States and here and in much of the global north as well. But unions played an important role in winning those policies by exposing some of the depredations of industrial capitalism during the interwar and post-war eras. Capitalist society is inherently unequal, and it wouldn't work if it wasn't, at least to some degree, unequal. And I don't think that this is a controversial statement. Some people cheer for it, think it's good or think it's necessary. Some people criticize it, but I don't think there's any serious dispute that this is fundamentally true. The people who own the businesses need workers, and people are only ever going to sell their labor if they're in a situation where they have to, where they don't have some other way independently to support themselves, where they don't own businesses of their own. And if everyone on earth decided to be an entrepreneur, to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, so to speak, there wouldn't be any workers left, and so nothing would get done. This fundamental inequality in society affords the people who own property, people who own businesses, the people who own shares in large corporations, a really wildly disproportionate control of power over working people's lives and over society as a whole, even in a democracy. Culture is shaped by privately owned media companies. Big businesses can afford to spend big money lobbying politicians. Even if they didn't, certain ideas about how economies function are so widespread now that politicians will generally do things that benefit big business, even without being pressured at all, because they believe it's necessary to keep the system stable and intact. Inequality is growing, and many of the social and economic problems that we're facing as a society today trace back to this fundamental inequality in our system. A major contradiction in our system is that it depends on inequality. As I said before, it has a tendency to cause inequality to worsen over time. It tends towards monopolies. It tends towards people using their profits to invest in things that will generate more profits. But at the same time, the system is also destabilized by rising inequality. The less that people can afford to buy the things that society produces, the more the economy slows. Growing inequality has also lessened our ability to respond to big challenges, climate change, racism, the crisis in housing affordability. Today's generation of workers is, for perhaps the first time in modern history, looking at a worse life with fewer opportunities than their parents had. Unions represent a meaningful threat to that fundamental inequality, and that's why so many employers and politicians have worked so hard over the last 40 or 50 years to undermine unions and keep them out. The evidence is really quite overwhelming that unionized workplaces are more democratic. Unionized workers enjoy more protection from unjust termination and mistreatment by employers. And unionized workers enjoy a fairly significant union advantage. They're paid more than their non-unionized counterparts with better benefits. The ability to bargain collectively also means that the wage gap between men and women and between white and racialized workers is significantly smaller in unionized environments. Unions have been a vital force for progress historically. Higher union density means higher wages for ordinary workers, and this results in lower levels of income inequality. But union action has also advanced progress in a number of other ways. It was bargaining and grievances and strike action by public servants that won access to workers' benefits and leaves for same-sex couples, a key victory on the path to a more inclusive society for queer people. In the 1980s, a strike by postal workers won expanded maternity leave for posties, and this paved the way for a broad expansion of maternity and eventually parental leave across the broader public sector and eventually the rest of society as a whole. A strong labor movement can benefit society in many ways and advance not just workers' rights generally, but attack inequality and injustice in all of its forms. The role that unions play in society and the threats that they face both underscore the importance of the labor movement's involvement in politics. Union members come from all walks of life. Black, Indigenous, racialized workers deserve a labor movement that fights against racism, Queer workers deserve a labor movement that fights against homophobia and transphobia. Disabled and injured workers deserve a labor movement that fights for a more accessible society. Many unions in Canada are doing these things, but the labor movement is not currently in a position of significant strength. Far from it, I think. Unions are facing down a lot of threats, many from employers and governments, but some of which I think may have been self-inflicted. There's a lot of anti-union sentiment out there, even among working people. A lot of it is unwarranted, and a lot of it represents some basic misunderstanding about why unions exist and what they ought to be doing. So as I said, Canadian unions are facing a number of significant threats. The labor movement, I think, is weaker than it has been in previous generations. Since the 1980s, there's been a very substantial reorganization of work, both inside of countries and within or between countries. Many former industrial cities, like places like Oshawa and Hamilton here in Ontario, for example, have had their former industries hollowed out. The largest employers now in cities like that are often universities and government agencies. We've also seen the rise of new forms of work, the sharing economy, what we now call the sort of gig economy, Uber, DoorDash, things like that. We've seen the erosion of what we used to think of as the sort of standard employment relationship, one employer, job security, decent income and benefits, and the rise of precarious work. We've seen the increasing use of a temporary migrant workforce with far fewer protections and hyper-exploitative working conditions in sectors like agriculture, food service, and caregiving. And I think it's fair to say that the labor movement has really struggled to adapt to these pretty significant changes in the way that the work is organized. We've also seen an increased willingness by governments to try to legislate away the right to strike, sometimes before a strike has even begun, to impose collective agreements and wage restraint on unionized workers, to try to restrict unions' ability to participate in politics and especially in elections, and so on. Some of the biggest employers today are also very notorious union busters or avoiders. Walmart, Amazon, Home Depot have all become kind of infamous for the lengths that they'll go to try to prevent workers from coming together to exercise some collective influence over their working and living conditions. And there's also anti-unionism among union members themselves and non-unionized workers as well, for a whole host of reasons that are really important to understand. Alongside these things, we're also seeing really major demographic shifts inside the labor movement. The rise of the public sector has meant the rise of women as a proportion of the unionized workforce. 31% of women workers belong to a union today, compared to 26% of men. And as of 2019, women made up 53% of union members, up from just 29% in 1978. A number of unions are facing a big generational divide as well, finding it difficult to get younger workers involved. Young workers are less likely to be unionized in the first place, and some unions have accepted two-tiered contract provisions that hurt new and future workers as a way to try to protect existing members. Because of this, a lot of unions are grappling with a crisis of representation. Elected leadership in many places often doesn't look like the membership does. Union leaders are often older than the average member, and leadership also tends to be disproportionately male and disproportionately white. As a result of all of this change, union density has declined, and the composition of the labor movement has also changed very dramatically over the past few decades. Today, only around 30% of workers in Canada belong to a union, meaning that union density overall has declined by about a quarter since the 1980s, when the number was actually higher than 40%. Despite all these changes, a majority of Canadians still express positive views about unions. Renewing the labor movement, I think, requires a lot of things. It means figuring out how to organize in increasingly difficult settings like the gig economy, but also in traditional strongholds. We still have a lot of auto jobs in Ontario, actually, but many of them are not unionized, as the unions have not yet succeeded to make inroads in places like Honda and Toyota. Organizing the unorganized is a huge priority, and there have been some recent victories. We could talk more about that if folks are interested, but I want to spend the bulk of my time talking about unions in politics, because here there is also a lot of debate about what unions need to be doing, about what's effective, about what's appropriate. So what can unions do? How can unions intervene in our society? How can they intervene in our politics? How should they do those things? Obviously, the first thing that unions can do is support the NDP. And I think there are good reasons why I think we still see that this is kind of the primary way that unions orient themselves to politics. The Canadian labor movement was a founding partner in the NDP. Many unions continue to support the party in elections. Many remain formally tied to the party in other ways. The NDP is generally the party most willing to listen to unions when it's in power. And historically, the NDP has been responsible for bringing in a number of pro-union reforms. Unfortunately, the legacy that the NDP has left behind when it's been in office is complicated and uneven. Here in Ontario, I think the legacy of the Rae government hangs very heavily. Staring down a recession in 1990, the Rae government's social contract imposed a wage freeze on public sector workers in what was seen by many in the labor movement as a significant betrayal. And I should say it's hard to know for sure what the other parties would have done had they won that election. Maybe this was still better for labor than the alternatives. Today at the federal level, the NDP's supply and confidence agreement with the Liberal Party is also straining this relationship, I think. The agreement includes a promise to bring in some pro-labor changes, but the Liberals also haven't been shy about using back-to-work legislation, and I wouldn't suspect the government's solution to inflation of jacking up interest rates to protect investors has been particularly popular with union members. Despite all of these complexities, I do think that support for the NDP remains the primary political intervention for most of Canadian unions. I think if you look across the entire sort of broad spectrum of the labor movement in this country. But a significant number of unions in Canada over the last, sort of more recent history have pivoted to encouraging strategic voting. A number of unions are doing this in an effort to prevent conservatives from coming to power. Conservative politicians have been responsible for many of the most overt attacks on unions and workers' rights, and for many of the policies contributing to rising inequality and some of the things that we're talking about when we're talking about being a force for progress. It's not altogether surprising that some unions would decide that keeping conservatives out is more important to worry about than it is to worry about, who beats them. But there's not a lot of evidence that unions' strategic voting campaigns really work. And in general, they tend to operate like tacit endorsements. And in some cases, they come with outright endorsements of Liberals, at least in ridings where the NDP is seen as uncompetitive. Nevertheless, I would say that this appears to be sort of the second most popular political strategy for unions. Unions could also support other parties, right? They could outright support Liberals. They could support Conservatives. There are other parties. There's a Green Party. There's a handful of, communist and more left-leaning parties. So unions could go one step further and sort of abandon the NDP altogether. Some unions, particularly public sector unions, have endorsed Liberals. Recently, especially here in Ontario, we've seen some unions endorsing the Conservatives. I think these parties both have a more clear anti-union track record than the NDP. So all the same problems apply here, and I think worse. In the last Ontario election, a handful of construction and building trades unions endorsed the Conservative Party, and I think for pretty cynical reasons. And I'll circle back to this because I think it really cuts to the heart of a lot of what unions are grappling with today. But of course, unions could also start a new independent Labor Party, discard the baggage of an NDP that hasn't always delivered when it's been in power. It's certainly possible that doing this could pull the NDP back towards the left, halt the drift to the right that all the parties really have experienced over the last 40 years. I think there would be some support for doing this among the rank and file in some unions, but I don't think this is a serious consideration anywhere, at least not at the moment. And before I get to this last point on the slide, I just want to circle back and take a brief detour to talk a little bit about the relationship between working class conservatism and the labor movement. As I said, in the recent provincial election here in Ontario, a half a dozen construction and building trades unions endorsed Doug Ford's PC party in its bid for re-election. despite the fact that one of the very first things that the Ford government did when it came to office in 2018 in Ontario was rolling back the gains, most of the gains that we saw brought in by the Wynne Liberals at the end of the Changing Workplaces Review. And the Ford government also very quickly went on the offensive, as we saw in Bill 124, imposing wage restraint on the entire broader public service. Well, no, not the entire. He exempted police and firefighters while going after nurses and teachers and folks like that. Like many union endorsements of political parties, these endorsements were not, as far as I'm aware, made democratically by a vote of the membership. So they don't necessarily reflect how a majority of the membership or even a plurality of those workers felt about the election. But nevertheless, this was a major break from precedent. Doug Ford was getting ready to rip up the Greenbelt and making big promises around housing and development. And I think these unions thought that there was something to be gained by falling in line and supporting that. Those projects would obviously mean more work and more jobs for members of those unions. I don't know how much of an impact any of this really had on the election results. I'm not sure that anyone's really done a serious, sustained analysis of the question. It's not totally clear how much the rank and file member really even cares or knows what union leadership says about party politics, although certainly some do. And for folks who may be on the fence, seeing your union endorse a party that historically it hasn't, that may change your thinking a little bit. And while this was a break from precedent in terms of like the union leadership, historically the relationship between workers, unions, and conservative politics is actually a lot more complicated and quite thorny. Say, take the Hard Hat Riot, for example, in which the United States' largest labor organization, the AFL-CIO, organized a demonstration by construction workers to descend on and attack students protesting the Vietnam War. In the coming years, a white male working class backlash against progressive politics, Nixon's so-called silent majority, grew, pushing back on the civil rights movement, Black Panthers, queer rights movement, feminists, environmentalists, and so on. In 1982, xenophobic hysteria over the entry of Japanese automobiles into the American market culminated in the murder of Vincent Chin, a Chinese man mistaken for Japanese and beaten to death by an auto plant supervisor. Here too, racism and xenophobia bubbled over in response to the perceived threats associated with Japanese production. Nationalism has become an important part of the way that a lot of unions in Canada think about and, more importantly, frame the work that they do. And while it's true that unions do offer a lot of benefits to Canadian society at large, it's also true that unions don't exist to defend Canada. They exist to defend workers. But a Canada First mentality has taken hold, I think, in some corners of the labor movement, and this is a problem because the lines between that version of Canada First and the Canada First politics of the far right are not obvious, nor are they easy for unions to police. In general, there's a lot in far right politics that's very similar to the politics that some of our unions promote: a mistrust of elites, skepticism about globalization, and so on. And so I think it's actually really important for unions to be very clearly political, because vagaries and partial diagnoses really leave a lot of space for union members to drift to the right. We're seeing a lot of right-wing politicians picking up on that and overtly courting the union vote. The politics that say keep good jobs in Canada are intuitive, and they resonate with people. And at a time when unions, sometimes seem pretty desperate to win the big PR war, it makes sense to attach yourself to something that matters so much to such a big chunk of the population around you. But those Canada First politics have made it difficult for some unions to figure out how to organize or otherwise support the growing numbers of migrant workers. I also think those politics paper over problems elsewhere in a union's organizing work. Because if you're talking this much about keeping good jobs in Canada, you're probably not doing enough, effectively anyway, elsewhere to make all jobs in Canada good jobs, which they should be. So back to the fourth thing that unions can do. Unions can embrace, what I'll call here, broadly speaking, syndicalism. In terms of political strategies, unions could also just sort of abandon electoral politics altogether, right? And focus on using their power and influence to shape society in some other way. Take a kind of syndicalist approach. Unions could decide that partisan politics are altogether sort of a dead end, and instead spend that energy and resources helping to organize social movements or participating in their own forms of political direct action. Unions give working class people access to unique forms of political power. The examples I gave earlier of unions winning things like same-sex benefits, maternity leave, are relevant here, I think. Unions can be and have been a source of progress in society, even outside of the electoral arena. And there may be an argument to be made that that's where they're more effective. But unions have won some significant public policy changes by striking. And I think we saw a promising attempt at this with the recent PSAC strike around remote work entitlements. The union didn't get, exactly what it was hoping for in that settlement, but it got more than it was being offered initially, and it may represent a way in towards a further expansion of workers' rights in that area. This past fall, CUPE school board workers in Ontario defied a law that was meant to curtail their right to strike and impose a collective agreement, which would almost certainly have been found unconstitutional. But their illegal walkout forced the government to repeal the law anyways, and so the constitutionality is sort of moot. Because union members earn more and have better benefits than non-unionized workers, because they have a voice in how their workplace runs, the unions that represent 30% or so of the workforce are already doing a lot to keep inequality from getting worse. I haven't done the math, but if these workers were all earning instead what their non-union counterparts were earning, inequality would certainly be higher. And the opposite is also very likely true. Inequality would be lower if union density were higher, as it has been in the past. And higher union density would also mean the labor movement's politics would be more influential in general, leading to more pro-labor and pro-worker public policy. It's not necessarily an either-or sort of proposition either. Unions can certainly pursue both an electoral strategy and an organizing strategy. Most do, but in terms of partisan politics, though, I think it's really important to recognize that really every strategy short of supporting the NDP, whatever you think of the NDP, is a move to the right, tacitly or openly shifting support to the Liberals or the Conservatives, or parties further to the right than that. The parties primarily responsible for the massive explosion of inequality in this country, the reorganization of work through the expansion of so-called free trade, the repeal of numerous pro-labor laws over the last 40 years, the lack of meaningful, coherent, effective action on climate change, and so on. And so with that in mind, I think it's worth concluding by taking a look back at some of the significant developments of the recent years and months, beginning with the COVID-19 pandemic. In the years before the pandemic began, I think a number of unions were doing good work, trying to grapple with some of the challenges that I laid out at the beginning of the presentation. I think for a time, the sense in the labor movement was that the big unions and perhaps their members wouldn't really support organizing very low-wage, precarious workers because organizing is expensive. Existing pools of union dues are sacred, and low-wage workers would take forever to repay the investment, right? I think happily a number of unions have begun proving that sense false and demonstrating their concern with organizing everyone, especially the workers who are being treated the most poorly. The Canadian Union of Postal Workers has been supporting efforts to organize gig workers. We've seen an impressive number of victories organizing Starbucks locations across the United States and Canada, Starbucks being another notoriously anti-union employer, and the food services sector also being a notoriously difficult industry to organize in. So that's promising. When the pandemic hit, a lot of organizing ground to the halt. At least in the very short term. Some activists and organizers talked about becoming siloed. But as the pandemic wore on, I think it was an eye-opening and kind of politicizing experience, especially for young people. And I think it also got people used to doing more of their organizing digitally, which, while it has its drawbacks, might also offer new avenues to organize in some of those stubborn areas like the sort of gig economy. The pandemic brought with it a very sharp escalation in the rise of the far right in this country. And I think our unions generally missed an opportunity to really inoculate their members against it by putting together a compelling narrative about what was happening, leaving some members looking elsewhere for some way to understand what was going on. I think a lot of people intuitively felt like, hey, society lets people die because it's not profitable to help them all the time. Why the sudden change? Clearly, our governments knew that our hospitals couldn't weather the pandemic without all these restrictions after decades of cuts. And, wealthy people and politicians use the same hospitals as the rest of us, for now anyway. But I think a lot of unions could have done more to help their members see it that way. Instead, I think, too many unions, not all, obviously, but too many kind of just fell in with the government on vaccine mandates and lockdowns. And I think you could probably argue that there was a missed opportunity to keep some union members from drifting into the arms of the far-right conspiracy crowd by pointing out that these things had been made necessary evils by decades of greed and austerity, for which a strong labor movement could be an effective antidote. During the pandemic, a lot of workers who were already struggling after decades of cuts and low wages, healthcare workers, grocery workers, etc., were suddenly very important and were hailed as heroes. Frontline grocery workers, healthcare workers, long-term care workers. And as the pandemic gummed up global supply chains and inflation started to overheat, workers grew increasingly frustrated. Grocery workers had their pandemic pay premiums taken away not long after the pandemic began, while at the same time, their employers raked in record profits. Here in Ontario, nurses toiled under the wage restraint brought in under Bill 124, while the Ford government sat on billions of dollars in unspent pandemic money from the federal government and a huge unanticipated surplus. But it would have gone against the established orthodoxy of the last 50 years or so to redistribute any of that wealth back down to the workers. So governments and employers have really held firm, provoking strike after strike over wage and benefit demands that are, in the grand scheme of things, a relative pittance. As I said before, school board workers in Ontario staged a 2-day illegal wildcat strike across the province last fall in the face of the threat of massive fines by the Ford government. Solidarity poured in from unions across the country. Other public sector unions threatened to join. And in the end, all of that weight forced the government to repeal their legislation and return to free collective bargaining. The Public Service Alliance of Canada waged a 3-week strike over inflation and the right to remote work. They made some inroads on the latter point that may in the end benefit far more workers than just themselves. Time will tell. And I think a lot of private sector white collar workers saw that they were more productive at home than they are in the office, and have come to resent being forced back into the commute simply because their bosses don't want to let the commercial real estate market collapse. And in the last few days, we've seen 3 separate incidents of workers voting down tentative agreements with their employer and choosing instead either to stay on strike, to go on strike, or to return to the picket lines, all over the soaring cost of living. Time will tell. I think it's important to be really cautiously optimistic about proclaiming a labor resurgence. After all, we're talking about turning the tide from a place of historic weakness and disorganization after like 40 or 50 years of attacks and decline. A lot of what happens next will depend on labor leaders, how much they're willing to get out of the way and learn to follow their members rather than trying to contain them, and on union members as well. Public support for unions is high. But for the last few decades, the desire of non-unionized workers to unionize, even among the many of them who like unions, has remained stubbornly low. The labor movement really needs to work out why, keep making gains in these tough new industries, and really hold all political parties accountable when they hurt workers. It turns out that I timed this really well and had more or less exactly half an hour worth of things to say. So happy to, answer some questions or have kind of an open chat about some or all of what I've talked about. But thanks either way very much for listening and joining us on a Sunday afternoon.
Thanks so much, Chris. And wow, very interesting presentation. I would like to, at this point, welcome questions and comments. We have 2 questions in the Q&A. Please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. You can also raise your hand if you would like to ask your question directly, or if you have a very long question, as I see people write long paragraphs in the chat, feel free to raise your hand and ask your question directly. I have a question for you, Chris. If you could, you've touched upon it, but if you could say a bit more, expand on the issue of precarious employment. What specifically have the unions been doing or are doing? If they have been successful, what kinds of organizing campaigns are out there? As I guess there's an increasing number of precariously employed people, and they do not have access to the support networks that labor unions offer, right? They inhabit sort of a different universe. A lot of them have digital lives that are isolating. So how can sort of the distance between, on the ground labor unions and this digital labor force, which is increasing, be bridged? And yeah, what's being done?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. I think in some ways we tend to kind of overstate how different the world of precarious work is today from how precarious work was in the 30s and 40s, when the sort of modern labor movement as we know it today was beginning to sort of come into being. But there are a few significant ways in which it's very different, right? You don't have people working in a single factory all together for long hours and then heading to the pub after to talk, or heading to community spaces to talk. People who are working, especially in the sort of platform economy, which is, I think, the popular place to think about these kinds of issues, they often don't even know each other. So there's lots of organizing through sort of like Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups, and having to get very creative about finding ways to get in touch with one another. I think that in some sense we're seeing people grappling with perhaps the need to really rethink the union form as a whole and what it looks like, and whether the form as we know it of an organization in a specific place with a brick and mortar operation that organizes everyone with one employer in one site being under one collective agreement, the sort of standard auto worker, steel worker kind of arrangement from the 40s and 50s maybe doesn't apply as much to a lot of the sort of modern problems. And so the question is, like, can the structure even sustain that kind of adaptation, or do we need a whole new structure? So could unions look something like a platform of their own that members could participate in? Maybe it's in the form of an app or something like that. And I think that there has been some work done in terms of some of the big unions staking out a little bit of jurisdiction and saying these are the workers that we're going to try to help support. And it makes good sense for the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, for example, to be supporting delivery drivers, because that work is very similar. The main sort of difference is that you've got an employer in a lot of those cases that's just trying to pretend not to be an employer. Right? You work for Canada Post, you work for Canada Post. It's clear that you're an employee of Canada Post. Canada Post doesn't yet, anyways, as far as I'm aware, try to pretend that people are independent contractors with their own delivery companies. But the work by and large is the same, right? Going and picking something up and taking it somewhere else. So there's lots of information sharing to be done there. There's lots of ways that the Postal Workers Union can support those kinds of workers in ways that maybe other unions would be less prepared, in terms of things like health and safety on the road and all of that kind of stuff. I don't want to speak out of pocket because it's not totally the area that I study, but I also think that there's been some work recently to try to get labor law updated in Ontario to recognize the kind of growing incidence of like this kind of way of organizing work. And all I would say is that I would suggest that people take a look at the changes that have been made, I think recently in Ontario, because as I understand it, there may have been an agreement struck between a large union and the government to sort of carve out a new kind of liminal space for these kinds of workers, where they'll be unionized with some benefits and but then not treated as workers in other aspects. So I think as unions and as governments and as civil society is trying to grapple with those changes, I think it's probably also important not to get so creative with it that we find ourselves giving away things that working people, who are doing those jobs wouldn't necessarily want us to be giving away on their behalf, especially if they're not members of the union and they haven't had a chance to vote on any of those sorts of arrangements. But I do think that, like, baristas rise up, and the wave of sort of Starbucks stores across the United States and trickling into Canada that have organized, is a positive sign. Because like I said, I think that's a sector and an employer that's historically been a really tough nut to crack. But the pandemic, I think, has given people, a new sense of how important they are in the grand scheme of things, in a way that, like, the rise of precarious work was always sort of designed to make people feel like they were very easily replaceable. And yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Let's go to the Q&A. Here's a common question. My union in the university has been wonderful. It has provided me with daily work advice and how to respond to administrative instructions that seem problematic. It has also provided me with social opportunities to meet with colleagues. It is great to have a union negotiate my salary increase instead of having to do it myself. The union has also been great on LGBTQ plus rights, pay equity, and other essential social issues. Do we agree that unions should be endorsed by humanists?
Well, again, without thank you for the question, and without speaking out of pocket, because I'm not a member of your organization, I think that for any organization or group of people that are committed to, the idea of thinking critically about the world around us, and trying to be guided by evidence and reason, I think there's a really strong case to be made for endorsing unions, because of all of the things that the person who's asked the question has laid out, and because of some of the things that I mentioned in the presentation, that unions, and I don't want to pretend that unions are like this perfect sort of thing without problems, because obviously I think that there are important criticisms to be made, and we should be thinking critically about unions as much as employers and in society as a whole. But unions make workplaces better. I think if you look back in the historical record and you go back into the 80s and 90s, I think that in a lot of union newsletters, you'll see things that will surprise you in terms of unionists 40 years ago taking really principled stands on things like Palestine and South Africa, on LGBTQIA plus rights, on Indigenous sovereignty and the need to be in solidarity with Indigenous people. I mean, the union movement, I think, has a much longer track record of being on the right side of history than people would necessarily give it credit for. And I think, marginalized workers are better off in a union than not in one. And I also think that people in general benefit from a strong labor movement. And as I said, I think one of the most important ways in which the labor movement can continue to be a force for progress and can become a more effective force for progress is to grow, to renew itself, to get new members, to bridge the generational divide. And I think that the more organizations, the more people, even folks who don't have unions or folks who have unions but maybe don't get involved in them as much, the more that people can talk positively about unions, in an honest way, and help people see the benefits and encourage people to stand up for themselves and encourage people to talk to their coworkers about the benefits of unionization. I think all of that stuff is really important. And I think that if people do that sort of stuff in their workplace in between elections, I think that on average, most people will have a much greater impact on the future trajectory of our society than going to your local community center and casting a ballot for a political party once every 4 years. Not to dunk on electoralism at all, but just to say that like politics doesn't take breaks in between elections, and we shouldn't either. And the labor movement is an important way in which we can continue to sort of push for progress and human rights and for a society that really benefits, as some would say, the many, not the few.
Next question is from Brad Evoy, who is sending his greetings. Over to you. Something we've spoken about in other meetings and spaces is the need for humanists to be directly involved in organizing and community, and that our ideals align with the kinds of organizing that unions do. What are the barriers that you see to this, and how do we further overcome them together?
Well, I thanks very much, Brad, for the question. I think, I'll maybe answer the question from the union perspective on it, because that's the space that I'm familiar with. But like, I really think that it's kind of strange to say, but like there is a huge preoccupation with work and jobs, rather than sort of like justice and rights. And I think that sometimes that can be a barrier. I mean, I think there are obvious reasons why people don't want to lose their jobs. And I think especially in a society where like a lot of our, social safety net, so to speak, has been more or less dismantled. Like, it's not surprising that people are like they're willing to do pretty much anything to sort of not lose their jobs. But as one of the auto workers that I spoke to in an earlier round of research said, like, as soon as you start negotiating for your job, you've stopped negotiating, because at that point you're sort of willing to accept more or less any working conditions, any sort of, and I think that that's a barrier. And I think that it also becomes a barrier to thinking about a world that would potentially be radically different from the world that we live in now, right? I mean, I think that there are lots of debates going on now about, degrowth versus growth. Like, is it possible to build a more just society and continue to grow and use more resources and exploit more of nature? Or do we need to, sort of tamp down? And I think that kind of contradiction in the labor movement makes having that debate complicated, because people don't want to lose their jobs. And I think that, in a sector like auto, for sure, it's been a very long slog to get unions in that space to kind of take environmental politics as seriously as they need to. But I also think that on the other side of it, like, in the sort of civil society space, or, folks outside the labor movement, I also think that, like, I think there's a tendency to dismiss working class people, and to think that, like, I pointed out some examples of working class conservatism earlier, but I think that there is a tendency to kind of assume that every auto worker you meet is going to see the world that way, is, going to read the Toronto Sun, or, whatever sort of conservative leaning paper circulates wherever you're watching this from. And I think that's also a mistake, because as I was saying, like, go back to the union newsletters from the 80s and 90s, you'll be surprised at the kind of stuff that you'll read in there in terms of people really encouraging their coworkers to think that another world is possible. And, so I think it goes both ways. I mean, I think the labor movement needs to think a little bit more creatively and critically about its role and about the role of work in society. And I think that, folks in academia, certainly, and in civil society, have to make sure that they're not writing off the labor movement because they think that it's sort of backwards or conservative or whatever, even though sometimes it's hard to ignore evidence that that's like increasingly true. But anyways.
Here's the perfect question for that. Perhaps the reason workers are not willing to unionize is that they're conditioned by the years of right-wing propaganda coming from the American right. Staying out of partisan debates, is there an alternative worldview unions could be promoting, and how to present it so that it's not seen as an old hat?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, I think obviously even like lots of union members, despite benefiting from a union, will come up to you if you let them and will tell you reasons why labor movement is backwards or unions are bad. Yeah, I mean, I think that the labor movement generally is very occupied with trying to convince people not to believe right-wing anti-union sort of propaganda and the sort of like associated worldview of like trickle-down economics and all that sort of associated stuff. But I also think that the rub is that sometimes in order to protect ourselves from those criticisms, we don't engage with good faith criticisms in good faith. And I think that like if right-wing propagandists are saying union leaders are corrupt, it's important for people in the labor movement to be honest and say sometimes, yes, but probably not as often as corporate executives and politicians are behaving in ways that are unfair and inappropriate, right? And that we call out those kinds of things when they happen, and that we seriously reckon with the reasons why those things happen and try to reorganize our own institutions to try to safeguard against those things. If people think that union leadership is corrupt, sunlight is the best disinfectant, as they say, and maybe unions could afford to be a little bit more democratic and a little bit more transparent. And I think they'd be more effective if they did those things anyway. So there's no reason to shy away from engaging with trying to prevent those criticisms that are being made in bad faith from becoming true, right? And I think it's fair to say that, like, in other corners of society, corruption is tolerated in a way that it's not in the labor movement. And, we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. And I think in general, when we talk about the reasons why people, especially people who support unions and think that they're good, but don't think they personally need one, I think we really need to think through, what does an organizing conversation look like with a person who feels that way? That the labor movement is important. They don't buy the right-wing propaganda, but they just don't think that it's necessary for them, because that's a whole other kind of conversation. And I think you see that in some of these sectors. I mean, I think I mentioned a little bit that the inability thus far for auto unions to sort of get into Toyota and Honda. And like part of it is that auto workers at Toyota and Honda get paid fairly well, right? Like that's a better job than lots of jobs in those communities, and reinforcing that it's only a better job because of union density elsewhere in that sector, because people aren't going to be tolerating being paid way less for the same job as, than people who work at the other plants. Emphasizing that and encouraging people to think about the reality that, like, even if you already have good pay and benefits, if you had a union, they'd be even gooder and better, right? But also that, like, unions do a whole lot of other stuff, and that the larger the share is of society that belongs to unions, the better that the public policy outcomes are for all of us. The lower that inequality is, the more influential labor politics are. And I think all of that is important to be working into organizing conversations. And I think that, like, we don't go down that road because we think that people won't care. We think that people really are just like me. What's in it for me? What have you done for me lately? But I don't necessarily think that's true. And I think that maybe, especially with the younger generation, if people saw a labor movement that really was like bold and thinking critically and listening to them, right, and saying the same things that they're saying about the ways in which the world could be better, I think we might have even greater success organizing those folks rather than always sort of focusing on the sort of me of it. And I don't know if I really answered your question at all, but thank you.
Cool. What is the union's take on the idea of a guaranteed basic income, if they have one?
I don't know. I guess I could speculate, but I don't really know. I haven't heard or encountered that, maybe just because I haven't looked for it. Like I said earlier, like I do think there's like a bit of a tendency to be kind of workerist and to be like, oh, good jobs are everything. And, you know, like we don't maybe put as much emphasis on other things that working class people need when they don't have jobs. And I think that there's probably a concern in some corners of like the labor movement and like maybe the left more generally, that like a universal basic income will demobilize people. It'll make the unions less powerful. You know, and that in the long run, it'll be kind of like a neoliberal technocratic kind of solution to a problem, and that eventually governments will just be paying everybody the same sort of very bare minimum subsistence amount of money, and there won't be any jobs left, and robots will be doing everything, and everyone will be poor except for like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. And that's I don't know, the way that things are trending, that's not a totally impossible way for a UBI to end up. So, you know, I think that there's probably reasons to think critically about winning a major social change like that in the with the current constellation of social forces, let's say. Because are we likely to win a UBI today that's really like a pro-worker UBI rather than a pro-company, you know, pro-business class UBI?
But why wouldn't you say or think that this is a terrain to fight on as well?
Sure. And I
Or a
think that,
pro-worker UBI, version as opposed to a neoliberal version.
sure, for sure. And I think that another good thing about UBI is that like a lot of people who aren't well versed in like leftist politics or union politics are thinking about a UBI. It's a way to have a conversation with people about like a really radical change that could really reconfigure the terrain that we all live on. And I think like the fact that people are willing to think about kind of a bold new world coming out of the pandemic is a good thing. I think unions probably should be intervening in that conversation in some way.
Exactly, because I was just going to say that I'm not sure how many people opposed the CERB, right, during the COVID lockdown, which was, I guess you could say a form of guaranteed basic income for a while.
Yeah.
So we just have a couple of minutes left. So if you guys have any more questions, please submit them in with the Q&A. And in the meantime, I'll ask maybe my last question. How do unions position themselves in the realm of global politics today in terms of what's going on globally?
Yeah, I mean,
What are some of the key issues that you're focusing on, endorsing, organizing around, etc.?
well, I mean, I think that an underappreciated area of importance for unions is building global solidarity. And I think that in as far as unions do participate in like international unionism, it's often in a very particular way that's very distant from the average member, that doesn't have like a huge impact on the way that the average member sort of sees the world, and that doesn't really link to the kinds of power that working people have. You know, it's a lot of the union's interventions in global politics are about raising awareness and providing support for struggles in the global south. I mean, after the Rana Plaza collapse, for example, lots of unions in Canada have made relationships with garment workers in that part of the world. And I think that like all of that stuff is sort of important, but none of it requires us to make any sacrifices on our side. And I think that there are ways in which working class people can use their power to change global politics. I mean, working class people in Canada participated in a week of direct action against South African apartheid in the 1980s during a sort of big global movement against apartheid that ultimately did sort of bring down the apartheid regime in South Africa. And I think, like, there are things that the labor movement could be doing in support of Palestinian human rights, for example, that go a little bit beyond, being critical of Israeli attacks on human rights. And I think, also, given how complicated the politics are, well, they're not complicated, actually. The politics around Israel and Palestine are not complicated, but it's an issue that provokes a lot of controversy and strong opinions in Canadian society. So it's good that some unions like CUPE are taking a position at all and have supported, BDS and things like that. But it's a far cry from the kinds of things that the labor movement was doing 40 years ago in support of, movements for justice in the global South, I guess I'll say.
Well, thanks so much, Chris, for this insightful dialogue. Thanks to our audience for attending. If you have a moment to share your thoughts about the webinar or suggest a topic or speaker, please fill out our survey. As always, you will find the link in Zoom's follow-up email. I'd also like to remind you that we are supported by memberships and donations. So if you'd like to become a member, if you're not one already, or contribute to our educational programs, you can do so on our website, www.humanistcanada.ca. And finally, stay tuned for announcements about our next events. We will be taking a break in August, and we'll be back with our fall webinar series in September. Thanks so much for being here. Once again, Chris, thank you for joining us today, and have a nice rest of your day.